So before I turn our fireside chat on ethics in learning at scale over to Candace to introduce our panelists and dig in, I just want to thank Candace for nudging us over the years to tackle this important topic of ethics. And we've seen it come up in very vibrant ways in a number of the papers that we've seen during this session. So thank you for all of you who are hanging in there with us till the end of the conference. And thank you, Candace. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm very excited to be moderating this panel with our three distinguished panelists. The way I thought we would run this is first I'll just do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then we will dive into the conversation. So I'll first start off with Dr. Stephanie Teasley, is a research professor in the School of Information and the director of the Learning, Education, and Design Lab at the University of Michigan. Her recent work has focused on assembling and utilizing institutionally held student data to design and evaluate new ways to support student success in higher education. From 2016 to 2018, she was also the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, SOLAR, and is currently the chair of the International Alliance for the Advancement of Learning in the Digital Era. Thank you for joining us, Stephanie. Next, we have Dr. Sydney Demello, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science and the Department of Computer Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. His research sits at the intersection of cognitive, affective, computing, and learning sciences, and he is interested in the dynamic interplay between cognition and emotion, while individuals and groups engage in complex real-world tasks. He has co-edited 7 books and has published close to 300 journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings in these areas. Welcome, Sidney. Finally, we have Dr. Ellen Wagner, who is a former educational technology professor and department chair, who left the academy to join an ed tech startup just as browsers first began enabling the web. She co-founded the Predictive Analytics Reporting Framework, or PAR, as all of us know it as, which was a research project that sought to find students at risk of dropping out of college. PAR operated as an independent 501c3 until it was acquired by Hobson in 2016, and is now part of the student success software product called Starfish Retention Solutions. Ellen's current work at the Institute for Simulation and Training at the University of Central Florida explores new use cases for applying emerging technologies to address problems in the academic settings. Welcome, Ellen. So we know that the topic of ethics and learning at scale is really broad and has become increasingly relevant with the rush to online, given the current context of COVID-19. And when we discuss ethics in learning at scale, most of the attention immediately goes to the question of data, in particular learner data. And while the topic of the ethical and responsible use of learner data is core to all of our work, we want to make sure that we also have time to explore other critical topics in ethics in learning at scale. So I'll start off by asking each of our panelists to share some brief thoughts on the ethical questions of learner data, but then we'll move in to explore other topics. So following that brief discussion of learner data, I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce one issue regarding the ethics of learning at scale that is of particular interest to them. And we can talk about those issues for a bit. And then I might ask a few topical questions and then open it up obviously to you as the community to ask your questions and join in the discussion. I'll monitor the chat during this session for questions. And now remember, the purpose of this session is for us as a community to explore critical questions around ethics and learning at scale. So please do take advantage of these esteemed panelists and raise your questions and raise the issues that are important to you. So with that, let's begin. with each of our panelists opening comments on the question about the ethical and responsible use of learner data. So Sydney, could I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Candace, and hi, everybody. So what I'll focus my comments on is that realizing that we're in a really big changing time. So there's COVID, but in addition, there's a lot of learner data being paired with more advanced AI algorithms. And AI and learning is now more on the radar of people, students, teachers, parents, right? And I think from past experiences, when computing has had a large experience in people's lives, you can look at social media, you know, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and then there was a lot of pushback when people saw what was actually occurring. I don't think as a community we have the luxury to just go, go rogue up front, and I'm not saying we're doing that, but I think we should be thinking how our technology is going to be perceived 10 years into the future. Is there going to be a reckoning of AI in education like there might be of social media, right? Do we want to be labeled and in the same, in the same group as, as big tech? So one way to think about this is to embed ethical principles from the ground up and using frameworks that incorporate ethics like directly in every decision. One of them that I like is called a framework of responsible innovation. And it talks about collective, how you collectively develop technologies by focusing on 4 key dimensions: inclusion, I know we're going to talk about this later, responsiveness, anticipation, and reflexivity. So, so this is just one framework, and I think the main message is, be thinking about frameworks of architecture as how we architect our systems, frameworks of machine learning. We need to also systematically consider frameworks of value-centered design and responsive innovation that put ethics and ethical treatment as central design features and not as afterthoughts. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Sidney. Ellen, would you like to make some opening comments about the responsible use of learner data?
Thank you, Candace, and thank you for your remarks, Sidney, and thank you everyone for being here in this session. I can't imagine any one of us trying to approach doing our work without having some type of ethical framework guiding the work that we do. Nevertheless, ethics inferred that we have some type of a framework to guide our work, which infers that we as a community, we broadly as a community have actually created that guidance. And I think what many of us have learned in the last number of years as we've been starting down these pathways of working with student data is that I think we made a lot of assumptions that in fact we all thought we were on the same page, and the more that we've started actually diving in to do the work, that perhaps we weren't as close with some of those assumptions as perhaps we thought we were. And I'm actually quite delighted to have had the experience of actually working on the PAR framework, which was a research project trying to take learning and data to scale at a time 10 years ago now. Sidney, as you mentioned, what happens when we come back 10 years ago? We actually started PAR about 10 years ago, very naively in some respects, like what happens if we took a bunch of academic data, put it into a giant federated data set, secured it, but started looking for patterns that could tell us what makes students drop out of school. And after we talked to a few funders and people laughed about it, well, nobody's going to let you do that. We actually found ways of being able to do some of that. And what we did realize is that in putting our sample together to take a look at the students, we had for-profit institutions, we had not-for-profit institutions, we had community colleges, we had four-year institutions, we had private schools, we had public schools. When we built this, and it was highly exploratory, and frankly, I don't think most people thought we could do it. What we realized we also encountered was the fact that every single one of us assumed we all had the same value constructs around our data, and we weren't far off, but we discovered some interesting things that we actually had to articulate very closely what it was that we all thought we were doing together in terms of how we would share our data. In fact, came to some points of some shouting among the partners, because in fact our not-for-profit people really were not allowed to share student data in the ways that our community college partners believed that they were obligated to share data, because they were regulated from doing that by the Federal Trade Commission. They were forbidden from doing that by the Federal Trade Commission. So there was just a lot of learnings for us that you can never assume that you are operating from the same basic guidance. And so I think your point about finding guidance and articulating frameworks so that you can be sure that the ethics that you believe you are operating from are in fact the same ones, and that you don't make the mistake of making assumptions where there really should not be any. So as we go forth in this conversation today, I have, oh my gosh, I have so many examples of where the good intentions of our research would just find themselves some days just what happens when you uncover things that we didn't know we were going to uncover. What do you do? And to share with you some of the things that we found ourselves having to do. So I'm looking forward to sharing a few stories with you.
Great, thank you, Ellen. And Stephanie, both Sidney and Ellen have talked about the importance of being explicit about our frameworks for sharing data and ethics. Do you want to speak to some of the frameworks or guidelines that you've developed at the University of Michigan around those issues?
Yeah, I've been doing this really for a long time. I think before we were even calling it learning analytics, and I got into it because I was managing the group on our campus who were helping with the development of our learning management system. And they were the help desk people, many of them. And we would get calls that asked questions about what students had done or not done in the LMS. And some of those questions were easy to answer. Like a student said, help, my professor says I didn't turn this in. I'm pretty sure I did. Can you figure out whether I turned it in? So we could go to the LMS log data and check that out. The flip side was when an instructor called and said, I want to know what time every student turned it in, because the students who turned it in right at the last minute, I think, are different than the students who turned it in earlier. And so quickly began to realize that there were definite ethical issues in thinking about responding to these requests. We even had occasionally a parent who would send us a message saying, can you tell me when my child's grade, my student's grade has been posted? No, we can't. That's clearly a FERPA violation. So I've been really working over time with the other people at my university. I've been thinking about this moving target about data and data accessibility and availability, and really thinking about how do we develop guidelines and practices for dealing with these kinds of issues. And at Michigan, what we have right now, of course, is the baseline is the basic compliance with any relevant laws and regulations, right? So of course we think about FERPA, common rule, those kinds of things. Those are a given. But where do we go from there? And at my university, instead of setting a set of rules or yes, no kind of policies, we developed guiding principles, which I think is kind of a concept that both of my other panelists have mentioned too. So at Michigan, these guiding principles are first, respect for the rights and the dignity of learners, and that's pretty consistent with a lot of other policies. Transparency about informing students what we're doing with their data. We're not asking them if we can use it, by the way. We're not asking them to opt in or opt out, but we are informing them that we do have access to this data and the terms under which we use it. Accountability, of course, the university has to be accountable if there were security breaches, if there were uses of this data that violated the integrity. And we just basically have an obligation for stewardship of this data. The next one I think is very important, empowerment. A guiding principle is empowerment, such that we only use the personally identifiable information if we're going to be able to do so in a way that provides services or informs what we know to benefit the students from whom the data is gathered. And the last one is something that I think Ellen also mentioned, is this idea of continuous consideration, right? We can't just say, okay, we're done. We got our guiding principles. Let's all take a break now. We don't need this committee anymore. Of course, as the world changes, we need to be thinking a lot about what these data are, where they're coming from, and what's our responsibility in our stewardship of them. So I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Yes, some of the issues that have come up during the paper presentations are things about when the type of data that we are collecting might be different than the type of data that historically a lot of the data governance policies were considering. Like the presentation on wearable technology. We're starting to collect data on students' emotions, on students' locations, in addition to just maybe traditional LMS kinds of questions. I also am interested in hearing your thoughts about when data is observation, and some of the social facilitation or social inhibition research literature that essentially tells us that the way students learn and the way they perform in a learning environment will change when they're being observed or when they're not being observed. And so is if students are aware that we are collecting and using their data, would that act as a way of social inhibition or social facilitation? Anyone's thoughts on that?
Well, and Candace, may I add to your question, because the difference between the type of research that so many of you are doing, which, being in this event really restores my faith in the educational technology, learning at scale world, because it's a place where, in fact, you all are not constrained by whether or not you can take your research to market, where that's more the world where I live. The fact that I'm just going to leave it at that. The fact that you can actually look at the real research questions does restore faith here. So I'll just leave it at that, because sometimes I can't always do that. Never let it just be said.
So I would just add one thing. So Candace, to your question about observation, it's really interesting. So we've done observation in two ways. One is observations in classrooms, which as you may know, it's considered observation of normal educational practices. We've actually found there that you do get some kind of reactivity. We always try to look disinterested and such from students. However, I've done a lot of observations of one-on-one students with computers, with cameras, and they're little. They notice it for about 5 minutes, and then it's totally forgotten completely. And because I've watched a lot of these videos, and I almost wonder if we need to remind them that you're being observed and you're enacting some. So there's a kind of an ethical question on informing them, reminding them of observations. That's something to ponder.
Yeah, I agree with Sydney. I've done videotaping, and the students maybe notice it at the early on, but then you find them whispering to each other, even though they know they're wearing microphones and the camera is on. And I think there is something similar with this kind of automatically collected data. I remember one time teaching when our then LMS we used then, captured for the instructor in the discussion board, it quantified it. How many posts did the student make? How many replies? How many words? Which I didn't find educationally valuable, but I wanted to show the students in my class that the system was doing this. And these are students in the School of Information who you would think would not be surprised. Oh my gosh, the look on their faces when they realized that the system was doing that. Thankfully, I assured them that that wasn't how I was going to grade them. But I think today's students are somewhat nonchalant about it. In a recent panel that was a student panel at one of our Data Science Institute events, there was a panel of students talking about analytics and how they felt about the university doing analytics with their learner data. And the only data they objected to being collected was location data. That they thought was too far. They didn't want the university to be pinging their cell phones or to know where they were on campus. Now we are. And I would say that we have even more strict restrictions on using that data for anything. And I've never been interested in using it. But that was the only thing they really were like, no, that's too far. The rest of it, they understood and could articulate that. No, they knew the university was using this data to help them, but that they couldn't see how that would help them in any way.
Stephanie, even from a security standpoint, because that was one of the very early types of tools that we saw coming on campus, and it doesn't surprise me, but thank you for that insight. That's great to hear.
Yeah, no, I think we know why the university is collecting it, and they do want to know if they need to find somebody.
Sure,
right?
of course.
But
this is just an example. Again,
we talk a lot about it being a creepy factor. Right? What's the creepy factor for this individual? And that's going to vary from person to person. But they all agreed that that one was over the line.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sure Candace was going to, but this is where this notion of ethics starts. You know, is it ethics? Is it lack of comfort? And do we regulate it? Do we have to get used to it? And I'm thrilled we're all here to raise more questions about it.
Great. So in addition to the questions around the responsible use of learner data, which as people have noted in the conference chat, that these questions are being surfaced and discussed in the literature, especially around questions around AI and human interaction in general, not just in the learning space, but across the AI-supported human behavior space. So in addition to the questions about learner data, what are other issues? What are other ethical issues that you would like to surface specifically around learning at scale? So Stephanie, since I went to you last time, I'll go you first.
Well, I don't know if this is more of the same or if your question is somewhat different, but for me, I'm really curious about what do we think the notion of informed consent means in this kind of context where the systems are automatically collecting data. And one question that I push up against is, does transparency fulfill the idea of informed consent? So by telling students, as Sydney and I mentioned earlier, or reminding them that we're collecting this data, is that a kind of proxy for informed consent when we're not actually saying, can we capture your LMS log data, for example? Or by the way, we have access to your application, so we know your family income, and we know what high school you came from, we know how many AP classes you took, and so forth. So I think that that's kind of an interesting question about transparency and informed consent.
If I might just add to that, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So just one thing to get to the point of transparency. And this is just, you know, with now with Zoom and video conferencing, there's going to be a lot more collection of audio and audio data and video data, right? Which actually gets into really interesting questions of third-party consent. If somebody behind me is captured in video, you know, what happens? But one thing we've just learned is we had a study where we wanted to collect video data from middle and high school kids, and the school was like, no way. Except but what we did was we changed it up. We didn't collect the videos. We collected information from the videos and discarded the videos and showed parents literally printouts of this is what we're collecting. And you have to also make restrictions. So it's a collaboration, right? So we didn't collect certain types of facial textures because those are identifiable. So I think if you have a good faith negotiation and you know, and treat the participants and students and parents kind of almost as research collaborators, I think there's a lot more, you know, there's a lot more they're actually willing to open up to, you know, than if it's, I'm a scientist looking down on you and just collecting your data. And that's just one little thing we've learned.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Sydney. I'm going to use that as my way to jump in here. Nobody wants to feel like their data is being gamed. I mean, let's face it. The idea of informed consent. Well, every time I agree to go out on a website and do something, I mean, have I not given my consent by showing up? I sometimes, to this day, I wonder if people agree to register at a college, have they not given their consent for all the information they have willingly submitted to let people use that information. And yet clearly we don't have clarity on some of this, which baffles me. I mean, going to a doctor and submitting medical tests so that people can diagnose what's going on with me. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could make it that easy? But still, you know, these are early days. And so the fact that we are talking is exciting for all of us to learn how to be collaborators and how to learn how to confront, I mean, difficult questions, you know, and in anticipating some of the things we might talk about today. I was going out and looking for examples of places where I have had those moments of realizing that maybe you're not on the same page. And, you know, and sometimes it is a matter of, you know, the notion of taking something to market doesn't necessarily mean taking a product and selling it for lots of money, because in fact, you know, sometimes that's really not what we're talking about. Sometimes it's a matter of, can you literally take the research results that you all are able to generate and do something that all of us talk about, like transfer that information into practice in a way where the mere mortals among us, of whom I count myself one, that we can really look at the practice and think of ways to accelerate putting the things that you all learn into active practice. Sometimes the steps you have to do to get there are really different. In fact, I was looking at one organization looking at ethical education where in order to be ethical in education, you had to forego, well, that it was sort of, they swore to be against profit, surveillance, and exclusions, which of course anybody working with data, particularly corporate people working in data, that's all they were there for. And you know, that's a completely different conversation. That's not for today. And I hope that we all understand that that's just a position, and we get why it's there. We get it. But I mean, come on, you know, if we want to be able to make a difference in the world of learning broadly, we can't be enemies. Finding the common ground. And I think this is actually why, you know, in my, they're not cynical days, they're getting things done days. I mean, sometimes we can discuss ethics until we turn colors, but you know, some days are really, really good contract where you just basically say, this is what I'm going to collect. This is what I'm doing it for. This is how often I'm going to use it. This is who can see it. This is when I'm going to get rid of it. This is how we're going to revise it. Here's our document. Let's live happily ever after and revise it every 6 months. And you can get rid of 99% of the problems. So I'm like you, Sydney, I'm kind of thinking that, and Stephanie, you said the same thing. I mean, trying to make this not like this, I mean, yes, it's a code of conduct, but it's mostly a code of getting things done.
So some couple interesting comments to that point have come up in the chat. One of the questions is if we just, one of the concerns is personally identifiable data.
Well, of course.
So
sure.
If we just anonymize the data, does that take care of the problem? And then there's the other question, which we all know that given the diversity and amount of data, that you can often re-identify, de-identify data. So de-identifying data doesn't necessarily take care of the problem.
That's right.
The other issues, I think the point that you were making, Ellen, is that there's a balance between protecting the individual learners and being ethical towards the individual learner and the greater good, which I think the medical community struggles with. And there are guidelines for, you have personal medical records, but in times of a pandemic, then for the greater good, sometimes knowing, sharing information about you as an individual is permitted. So struggling, I think as a community, we're going to need to struggle. When is the individual and when is the greater good? And how do we have guidelines that support those things? The last issue that's come up is this question of consent, that often a solution that's given is to say the learner just owns their own data. And so they get to say what happens to their data or not, or they get to consent whether to opt into data collection or not. And as one of the people in the chat surfaced, is it really a choice? If you say to someone, you have the choice not to share your data or not to opt in, but if you make that choice, then you're not being considered for whatever the benefit is that people are getting by having their data examined, then do you really have the power to make that choice? And shouldn't that be more an institutional guideline that is using the power of the institution to actively protect learners? So I think those are all interesting questions. And I'd like to maybe move on from the data collection, but in the chat, people have also kindly pointed to resources where these issues that I think we're surfacing here are discussed and debated in depth. So I'd encourage people to explore those resources. So turning away a bit from the question of data collection, there are other ways in which ethics come up for us in our design of learning at scale. So I would, for example, I'll just throw one out there and ask for the panelists' response. Given the recent growing awareness of systemic racism in the US and how deeply embedded racism is, especially in American life, do we have an ethical obligation as educators and researchers to inspect our research and our teaching practices and to act with that new awareness? And if so, how?
Well, that's something that I feel very strongly about, Candace. When for years, some of my colleagues and I have been talking about how, as an institution, we have an ethical responsibility to use our data to improve our teaching and learning practices. And some of you may know a study published by my colleague Tim McKay, where they did an analysis of courses at my university, the large courses, over 400, over 12 years. So thank goodness the data wasn't thrown out each year. And looked at a very simple regression of the students' grade in that course against their GPA. So what did the students' GPA say they would probably get? And then what did they get in that course? And they found a group of courses for which students systematically got a lower grade in that course than their GPA would have suggested. And furthermore, when they looked a little more deeply into that data, they put gender into the model. And lo and behold, not only was there a grade penalty effect for these courses, the effect was bigger for women students than men students. And when they looked at which courses those were, yeah, it was gateway STEM courses. So here we've been talking about this problem in STEM for a long time, and this isn't the only place, or this isn't the place to solve this problem, but it quite clearly pointed out, and this was done at Michigan and then recruited a number of other schools, same pattern. And now there's an ethical responsibility to do something about that, right? And on our campus, there's we're calling it a foundational course redesign. So really sort of saying, what is it about these courses and how they're taught and how students are grading that are penalizing pretty much everybody, but really penalizing women? Thank you, Rebecca, for putting the paper link in there.
Yeah.
You're faster than I am. And well, we didn't put race in the model, but you can imagine if we did, or first generation college students, those kinds of factors. But I think analyses like these and others that sort of look at what are we doing? How are we contributing to biases against students? Just saying we let them in doesn't end our obligation to helping them be successful, and be successful in a not a one-size-fits-all model.
You know, our framework did so much work, especially with online students, and it wasn't, and we did all students, but of course, so much of the data we were able to collect focused on online students. And what's interesting is when we started doing that, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 8 years ago, and looking at, the student profiles of who was being successful in some of the online courses and the gateway courses, et cetera, we were finding lots and lots of things talking about the lower socioeconomic quartile of our students and their success in online, but how the blended course models didn't have the fall off in the same ways. Wow, that was really exciting. And Peter Shea and people at Albany, they've done lots of work in these areas. What are we seeing right now in all the talk about remote learning? Stuff that I'm able now to go back and resurface some of the research that people are saying, oh, this is terrible for populations at risk. Well, no, actually, it's not what you think. and how wonderful. Now, you know, we have to resurface research. Think about all the research many of us have already done that we can go back. Now, I can go back in online learning research right now and start saying to people, I know we're freaked out about COVID. I know that this is hard for people who haven't thought about this, but this is not starting from scratch. Once we take a deep breath, we can show you things that actually do work. So for me, the fact that we have data that actually show us how to do a better job has been one of the most exciting things I've encountered. I mean, for me, it's one of the reasons I took an academic sabbatic. You know, sometimes when PAR wasn't supposed to be sold back to a for-profit company, but it worked. And it was one of those things we had to do. But what it gave me a chance to do is actually go back and take an academic sabbatical again, because once you do that and you put in your time, I actually had a period of time where I couldn't compete in the industry. So I actually went back and did an academic sabbatical, and we dove back into the research, which is why I got to go back now and do work at the University of Central Florida. So, you know, the excitement is you all are actually providing the mechanisms through which we're going to be able to change the world if we have people who can also start talking about making the difference in practice. So you have no idea how excited you all have made me. Just wanted to share that.
Great.
Can I just add? Thank you. So to the question, just kind of three quick things. One is, so I think that there's a lot we can do as researchers, first of all, right? So if you may or may not be aware that the replication crisis in psychology, and you know, when the dust settled, they have a set of recommendations, and you can't publish a paper now unless you do certain things. I feel in AI, we can have an opportunity to do something similarly with respect to diversity of samples, equity of outcomes. So you imagine a paper is published, and it cannot be published until you actually address and you make sure you've attended to some of these issues. I would be supportive of something like that, some frameworks, and so some standards. Second, I think that one thing that I at least struggle with and is understanding that it's almost like 5 or 6 years ago, AI woke up and machine learning woke up and said, oh, there's this thing called bias and fairness. And it's like, I have a project with an industrial organizational psychologist. They've been looking at this forever, for 30 years, and they have detailed frameworks and models and everything. And I think, so I think some of these strategic partnerships with people who are working in assessments, and this is bread and butter, is really helpful. And the last thing I would say is that I think we should also have some humility, and I love this question you've asked, Candace, and acknowledging that really, you know, we are one part of the puzzle here, and there's a whole ecosystem, right? And we really, honestly, have limits on what we can do in terms of understanding the issues of incorporating sensitive information such as race in the models and acting upon it. And I would love to see more events in which, you know, we talk about philosophers about the ethical implications, talk to social scientists, and really come together with a more nuanced understanding of some of these underlying issues.
Yeah. So you've made a great suggestion, Sydney, of maybe offering some guidelines for future learning at scale conferences, and we could just set a model for the ways we want people to inspect their research or their data. So it's a great suggestion. So I'd like to, there's so much conversation happening in the chat that I'd like to, and I'm delighted, because the purpose of this session was not to answer everyone's questions, but to get people reflecting and really thinking about ethics in your practice, whether that's research or teaching. So can everyone see can all the panelists see the chat? Mm-hmm. So I guess I would like to invite anyone in the chat to, there's so much going on here. I'll see if I can find a question, but if someone wants to explicitly state a question to one of our panelists in the chat, I will direct it to our panelist.
Maybe I have something I'm curious about that's been on my mind. I think it's on other people's mind too. Can people hear me?
Yes, Chris, we can. Go ahead.
There was this story 2 days ago about how in COVID-19 times, the A levels, and I think the IB had something similar. So this is like college entrance exams, really had a poor rollout of an algorithm that would adjust people's scores. And I suppose this has got a lot of the world interested in ethics for our field. And also, I think it speaks to when we're having really big impacts on student lives, we have to be 10 times more attentive. I suppose that's more just a comment, but I wonder if other people got deep insights from this conversation that has been going on slightly more publicly than just in our community.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the issues I was going to bring up, is that when we decided to have this panel, it was pre-COVID-19. And then all of a sudden with COVID-19, so much of higher education and workplaces had to rapidly move online, which meant that a lot of the learning experiences were now technology mediated and happening through online mechanisms. And so I think it's the case of the need of moving online got a little ahead of maybe our philosophy or our tools in order to be able to do that in an ethical and responsible way. So I think it is absolutely, even now, even a more critical conversation. So I look for responses from our panel to Chris's comment.
So I'm Chris, thank you. I need to get more familiar with the specific controversy, but it actually does touch upon something that I think just a comment we've been facing in our own work, and I think all of us will face is, so, there's certain things you can do in terms of data and the models, right? But then you come to actually do some corrective action and take some action. Yes. And I think we're always really excited we really believe in ourselves and are really excited to roll out our features and test them widely. And I'm constantly and there's one specific scenario that's keeping me up at night, where we have a mechanism to give feedback to teachers on the quality of the discourse. Now you can imagine that being used to evaluate teachers, which is exactly the opposite of what we want. So so this idea of thinking about the consequences of rolling this thing out, and I think in CHI, you now have to write a section of your paper about possible unintended consequences of your technology and your innovation, and it just helps you think through kind of that process. And so I look forward to reading this article, but it seems to me it might be a rollout that probably wasn't thought through at all dimensions.
Stephanie or Ellen?
I'm bad at dual processing, and I just had to respond to the chat, and I lost.
I was doing that too. I was chatting, so I apologize.
No.
That's okay. What were you responding, Stephanie?
Well, Chris Edwards mentioned another paper by a colleague of mine, Gus Edward, and about a program he runs called Problem Roulette, which gives students a lot of opportunity to practice. It's really a kind of a drill and kill kind of program, but the students are using it a lot, right, in practice, and they're showing some effect from that. Now, of course, that data isn't shared with their instructors, because on the previous talk, the last one of the session about cheating, they could go in and look at how many practice exams a student did before the actual exam to make some kind of assessment about how hard they were working. The students who use Problem Roulette are promised that their use of it is not conveyed to the instructor for the course. So the instructor can't make judgments about how much they're studying or how much they care about the course for doing that. And so I think that's part of our transparency, right? Our principle of transparency is telling the students we of course can collect this, we'll use it for our research, but not in a way that it has any impact on your grade.
Great. So back to the question of systemic racism, what other practices or policies are we sort of ethically or not obligated to put into practice around the work we're doing in education?
You know, Ken, that's an excellent question about or not. I would be really interested in hearing people's reflections on that, because typically we're pretty good about the do's. I guess the don'ts are that, you know, we don't want to profile people. We don't want to do harm. Certainly, we don't want to exclude people from opportunity. You know, but I think we capture much of that. But I mean, I don't know. The what it's not. I mean, I guess I was talking with someone before the session, and they were saying, you know, Ellen, it's really not about ethics. When people get you involved in a conversation about ethics, they're trying to distract you. And that startled me as a conversation, because it seems to me that ethics would be one of the first places we would start. And their actual suggestion was get a contract. And the more I thought about it, that's one of the reasons I included it in my points, because I realized that sometimes we get caught in conversations about our morality when what we really have to just do is to decide on what we will and will not do. So that's all I really want to say. I'd be very curious to hear your comment and the comments of others here, because I sometimes think that ethics is where we begin, and maybe we don't need to. I don't know.
Sydney or Stephanie, would you like to respond to the question of, do we even need to be talking about ethics?
Yeah, we definitely need to be talking about.
Well, I think we do, but yeah, but
yeah. Not to talk, right?
I guess that's it. I guess maybe that was my reaction, and so I have to shut up now and let you talk.
Well, no, I mean, I think that that's one of the criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement is there's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action, right? Mm. And so, I mean, so what are we going to do with it? And that's one of the things that I also have always appreciated about the notion of learning analytics is this: we have to focus on what's actionable, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't change someone's race, we can't change someone's gender. So those aren't variables right. that we can change, right? But what we can change is what the educational experience is for that person. And Renee asked, should research universities openly engage in research on how to improve teaching and learning on their campuses? That's what I was saying earlier. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I think that's responsibility. Our business practice is education. Why aren't we evaluating success of our business the way corporate businesses are asked? You know, we talk about student retention, we talk about time to degree. Okay, that's all great, but that doesn't get down into the nitty-gritty of how do we actually take a student who comes into our university or our class, and when they're done, we haven't just filled them full of content, we've helped them be better learners. And that, I think, is a really important mission. And I think that's something that, I mean, that's the impetus for my research. I've been interested in learning for a long time. Right now, we have new data and a new way to look at learning processes that we haven't been visible to us before. And I think that we should use that, leverage that for benefit, right?
Agreed.
I guess,
I
guess the reason I was asking specifically about race, or you could even consider gender, and I think, Stephanie, this is borne out by the paper that you cited. It's not the question of, you don't look at those variables because you're situating the problem in the learner. Looking at those variables and analyzing the impact of those variables is because it's acknowledging that the problem is situated in the system. Right. So the solutions wouldn't be to figure out how do we fix the deficits, if you will, of the female student in those STEM courses or Black students in general. It is really inspecting our systems and structures for how they are systematically disadvantaging students and then taking action against that.
Right. So it would be really unethical to take those results and say, see, this proves that women aren't as good at math and science.
So
right?
to this point, Mary Murphy at Indiana basically started videotaping all the first-year STEM courses. The first course to see what language the instructors use to communicate to students, and this is exactly what she found. It was the type of language about belonging, women not belonging in physics courses, about being born brilliant, and there's a whole beautiful theoretical framework she has around that, and that's a great example where you actually have a mechanism now that you can correct. And I think they offer some kind of corrective training to the instructors to kind of diminish those gaps. One ethical conundrum that I struggle with, and I kind of love to hear your thoughts on this, is one of the things to get back to self-regulated learning, at some point when I was at Notre Dame, I was in this Building Bridges program where I was mentoring some freshmen. And I was always, what struck me was if you're a first generation student, it's such a wild world for you because you don't know how to study and there are these no self-regulation practices. And now, depending on where you are, the first generation students will probably be with an underrepresented group, right? So then the ethical questions come in. If you are identifying a set of students who might need support services, but are also correlated with a certain identity or a group, is this profiling? What do you do? And I don't have an answer. I'd kind of love to ask the panel what their thoughts are.
Yeah, that's a conversation that comes up on lots and lots of different campuses. And I guess I've noticed as I watched what happened as PAR Framework ended up going inside of the Starfish Retention Solutions product, all of a sudden we found ourselves dealing with a research question that's going inside of a product question. And as schools would take an advising tool like this, in fact, so that's exactly what people were doing. And what happens is individual campuses and advising organizations have to make rules for how that information is used. And it really, again, underscores what happens when you have a great research tool that turns into a product, that turns into a practice, that if you don't have some type of guidance for people who are now dealing with data to help inform advising, but may or may not be used that way, people who use the tools have to have guidance for how they intend to use that. And I don't think that in the case of a company can't come in and say, this is what you must do to use your tool effectively. But when you sell that into environments, if people aren't informed on the front end that you have to do it, I mean, that actually for me was one of those things that when you came out of a research environment, no, you have to tell people to do that and you don't know what happens in implementation. Like you, I mean, it's just like, what is the obligation? And I guess we're finding out that schools have to do it and people get cranky if they don't. And we have a lot of people pointing fingers when it doesn't work. Again, opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, this came up as a question from the chat too. What does the panel think about registered reports? So unethical practice will at least be thought about out loud in the institution. So I don't know, panel want to respond to that question?
I'm not familiar enough with the registered report to be able to really speak to that directly. I think my comment about what happens when you, before, I think you probably get a sense of where I'm coming from on the requirement for individuals to make the rules for how they want to use this. I guess I'm just finding that when we start dealing with new technologies and tools and practices, you really need to have guidance for what you want to do with it and to articulate it pretty loudly and to be transparent. And I guess I have to let my colleagues talk to the registered reports specifically.
Well, I also don't know a lot about it. I haven't been following that very closely, except for I understand the part about registering your hypotheses ahead of time. But when I think about the research that I do, it's more time-based research. I'm not really sure what hypothesis that I would register ahead of time. I'm a loss to comment further than that. Sydney, do you have more?
Yeah, I just did one. Actually, a lot of nonprofit funders now require you to pre-register your studies. And so I just did one, and it's interesting. It's very clear cut for like a experimental study. And you're right, Stephanie, it gets a little trickier for correlational studies, which is what I did. I think it's a good exercise, and the types of research we do, where we have large data sets, we have mechanisms if we're doing responsible research to check for false positives and things like that. For me, it's more of a really good experience to go through it and to think through from all the different perspectives. And that was like a really invaluable experience, things you would never think about. And I think it leads to better research, whether you take that and that pre-registration and submit it to the open science framework is a different question. And I would recommend everybody just go to OSF and download the templates. They have templates for experimental studies, correlational studies, and it's amazing tool for graduate students when they're thinking through their dissertations and things like that.
And I think that sort of builds on what you had suggested earlier, Sidney, around adding some other dimensions, guidelines for registering your research. So that, like, what would be the critical questions we would want people to be asking, in addition to the open science questions, when they are constructing or imagining the research they're about to do. It'd be interesting. I don't know if the panel has a perspective on that, or if any of our people in chat have a perspective on that. What would be the questions that you would want someone to be consciously thinking about when they're designing their research?
Gosh.
So go ahead.
No, I'm just looking at the chat, and we do have, if you want to answer that, Sidney, go ahead, and then also I want to note that there is a comment, someone's asking to speak.
Okay.
Oh, I can't see that in the chat, so I'm sorry for failing as a moderator in that way.
Okay.
So whoever is asking to speak, please go ahead.
Hey there. So I'm a undergraduate researcher at the University of San Francisco, and I was just going to talk about kind of the implementation of some of these factors, especially in community colleges, where research isn't taken into account and student experience really isn't taken into account, which is something I really focus on. And it's really interesting to see where recently there was in California, they got rid of all remedial English and math courses. And when they did that, they didn't take into account the student experience, which is something that I think, let me see who was it? Jim Goodall was talking about, was kind of saying if it doesn't fit into the actual process and their actual business model. And it was just interesting to see that students aren't getting that voice through research, which is something I'm trying to expose, because a lot of students didn't like how they changed it. They didn't like how, when they made these changes, they got rid of some tutoring, they got rid of some counseling for transfer students that want to move out of a 2-year to a 4-year. So that was one thing I definitely wanted to just express, is that it's very difficult to get this data and to provide this data, because these business models, Jim said, it was they're planned years and years out. So I think that's where, as researchers, we need to come in with that continual data collection, and to show the progression of these minority students specifically, because even my research found that during COVID, students of Latinx identification versus their white counterparts, they all had nearly the same predicted academic course outcomes, but they were about 4 grade points lower. So whites got an A-, but the mean for Latinx was at a B-, C+. So it's, how can we change that experience? But we can't change that till we get that data. So I love this discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Yes, and then go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, just so you thought of that comment that Neil had, and also the question you had asked. So I think there's 3 just very simple things we can do, really simple. It all starts with getting voices at the table. So inclusion is really the place where I think everything starts, because if you don't have a good inclusion at the front end, you can't do anything at the end. So one, justifying the people in your sample. I think that's really critical. Second, any outcome is your machine learning model accuracy, your intervention accuracy, breaking it down by subgroup. That just has to be the default, right? You have to put that in. And I think these and the third thing I would say is a lot of the technologies we design wind up having large numbers of large rounds of design studies and feedback. And I think that's a place where it's really hard to get people. And we wind up working with the best teachers, the A students, you know, and so the input that gets into our systems, I've noticed this, is really quite different from the end users. So just doubling down on inclusion as just the core principle can go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how do we create different research paradigms or different technological infrastructures to be able to have a way larger number and diversity of the population, both researchers and students, end up in our research data? Yeah.
Right.
Great.
And let's not, yeah, I mean, we have to walk our own talk too. Look at your own research team, look at your colleagues, look at who you're inviting to the table when you select panelists or when you think about who to collaborate with, who to be on a program committee with, and so forth. I mean, there's still a lot of network effects going on. And if you're not connected, if you're not in the network, you're not at the table. And so I think in terms of ethics, we have to walk our own talk in terms of not just how we do the science, but who we do the science with.
And Jeremy brings up a good point also around personalization and the way people characterize personalization, where the proof of the effect is usually on the average student, which doesn't allow us to look at the impact on the different subgroups. So it's a great point, Jeremy. So, okay. So it is 12:20. So I believe we are we out of time or do we have 10 minutes
Get
left?
10 minutes.
Great, we have 10 minutes. Phew. So I got sidetracked by the time. There was another person in here who wanted to speak that I'm having a hard time finding.
Candace, if I may, there's this paper that I saw that Paquette and Baker did on EDM, actually journal articles. And like, it was basically saying we almost never collect demographics. And even if we do, we're not even looking for these interesting treatment effects of like, you know, are we harming African-American kids or whatnot? And that paper wasn't done on learning at scale, actually papers, but we maybe should just collectively ask ourselves, hey, how many of the papers that were even here do a good job of that? Like, maybe we should be thinking about review criteria to make sure we actually ask for, certainly when possible, certainly if they're reporting in a randomized controlled trial, we should probably demand them to look actually for differential achievement effects. I don't know if the panelists have thoughts on that. What do you guys think?
Well, it should be one good way of making sure you get the issues addressed. Yeah, I mean, of course, part of me is thinking about the long list of criteria. And on the other hand, if you don't ask the question, it's not going to show up. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
For me, it's really why I think I've focused more on the data that I have for the students on my campus versus MOOC data, because I have a lot of EII, right, on students on my campus, so I can be more systematic about thinking about what effects those kinds of things have. And that's the tension, right? Because the personally identifiable information is the thing that we get the most wigged about. But some of what work really needs to be done, I think, can't be done without it. And linking up different kinds of PII that normally would live in separate silos. And my campus admission information was different from registrar's information, was different from where the LMS data lived, until we put it all together in a student data warehouse. And as a researcher, then I can line up with the student ID the various types of data sources, anonymize it then, of course, at that point, and would never publish anything that would even come close to letting you figure out an individual student. But I need that data to understand, how are we going to help individual learners if we don't understand differences between the individuals?
That's right.
Oh, must be done in Facebook. Who's talking about that? Oh my goodness. Facebook, no.
Thanks, Jack.
Here's my other soapbox about ethics, especially with respect to universities, academic settings. You have to own your own data. Don't sign a contract with any vendor who won't give you your data back. It's your data.
And any vendor who won't do that is just somebody you have to ask why would you would want to work with them. And I just have to say that as a voice from the other side. I just said it. Just don't.
Right. Universities retain the rights and control over the data, which is why I don't like colleagues using free software,
Right.
that we could name, because you don't even know where that data is going and where it lives and what they're doing with it and how they're commercializing it. And oh my goodness, that's just not good.
Right.
Yeah, Zoom. Someone says, you mean like Zoom? My university made a contract with Zoom. I closed my personal Zoom account and reestablished my Zoom account through the license because we very carefully, quickly negotiated some specifics about Zoom data from accounts.
Yeah, and universities have that power to be able to negotiate those agreements. It gets back to the questions that were raised earlier about putting the onus of the responsibility on the individual versus the institution, both for an individual researcher to have to do this versus the institution making the the agreement. Yeah. And also, if we as a community start putting into place some of these guidelines for our research that like Sydney and others have been suggesting, then we as a learning at scale institution are taking responsibility for setting up mechanisms to support researchers to follow guidelines around ethical research. So I'm hoping that one of the things that come out of this conversation is a commitment on this from this community to really think about what would those guidelines be and how would we use them to support researchers to think about and reflect on, as well as implement ethical research and practice. And so there are some suggestions here in the room around that, in the chat room around that. There's a suggestion that Kai has already implemented requirements that you have to talk about ways that your work could be misused. So we've got some things already identified, sort of registering your research approach, being sort of interrogating your data to make sure it isn't, make sure it's representative or be able to speak to the ways in which it's not representative. Then looking at how could the results of your research potentially be used or misused. The transparency of how the data that you're collecting will be used with the research subjects, and then structuring things in such a way that you are intentional about getting the widest set of participants in terms of diversity and just sheer numbers to inform the research that you're doing. So those are some things that I've picked up from both the conversation and from the chat room. The chat room will be, there's excellent resources in this chat room. I feel like this is one of the huge values of this session, is all of the wonderful participation from the participants pointing us to resources and research and conversations. So the chat will be saved and people will have access to it following the conference. So we have about 2 minutes left. I'll leave the 2 minutes for each of the panelists to make a 30-second closing statement. Ellen, do you want to start?
I am happy to start. I just included a post to a report published, I think in the last week, from Titan Partners and Every Learner Everywhere, a Gates-funded project that's been, actually it's another one of the WCET managed initiatives. I'd like to point to people what it provides, the guiding principles and strategies for learning analytics implementations, some of what we've been talking about here, that I think, well, again, help people who are in the trenches of trying to make these things come together on their campuses understand that sometimes you just have to articulate your vision, plan your work, and work your plan. And sometimes it's just that simple.
Great, thank you. Stephanie?
I just want to really thank you for putting this together and all the input we've gotten. We acknowledged in our pre-planning meeting that between the four of us, we know only a part of what's out there. So it's really great to see other people chiming in. And lastly, I will just say that let's learn something from what we're living through. The pandemic has pointed out some really undeniable social equity problems. And I think with the massive amounts of learning online that's going to have to happen, not just in the fall term, but really for a while, we really have to think about what we're doing and how we can serve students who, especially those who are really, we know, at risk for being even more underserved by the online conditions. So, you know, keep up the good work, folks. Let's hang in there and see what we can do to help.
Great. And Sidney, you get the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Just two quick things. One, the last edition of the Handbook of Learning Analytics had a great chapter on ethics. People should check that out if they want to. But just to end with Stephanie's point, I could not agree more. You know, when things go wrong, it's always the most marginalized people affected the worst, and they have no voice. And so I think considering that from how we approach our research, you know, is a sobering thought, and I like to think about that a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody in chat who contributed to this true discussion of our community. So I'll turn it back to you, Susan.
Well, thank you to the panelists. Candace, thank you so much. And people have been noting what a great conversation, both the live conversation and the live chat